Hello, hello, hello. Today we're moving on with GCSE economics and we're looking at command, mixed and market economies. So let's get bloody into it. Here's a list of the things that we're going to go through, okay? We need to work out what a mixed market and command economy are. We need to define them, explain them, know the differences between them. If we can get on top of this, we can get on top of any question in the exam. So question then, do you remember the basic economic problem? Do you remember that every government in every country has to decide what we're going to produce? What have we got underground? Do we have coal, lithium, gold, silver, petroleum? Or do we have great human resources like Hong Kong, where we have people that are able to produce lots and lots of goods and services to a high quality? Well, every country needs to take a look at what they have resources-wise and decide what to produce. And usually a government and private organizations both make these decisions together, depending on how the government is stacked. Then we have to look at how to produce. Do we use factories? Do we use people? Do we use machinery? Do we use the northern plot of land or the southern plot of land? What methods are we using to produce these goods and services? And then for whom do we give them to? Do we give them all to the rich, like in America, where there's a highly capitalistic society? Or do we give them to everybody equally, like in Cuba, where they have a standard wage rate of around $24 a month? All these choices need to be determined by a government and private businesses, and we've got to determine how much government gets involved and how much the private sector gets involved. And for that, we have three kinds of economy to explain it. Before we dip into the three kinds of economy, we've just got to take a look back at what it used to be like in a traditional economy. So in a traditional economy, there are tribes, and decisions are often based on customs and bartering. In the exam, they love to ask you about how money has changed from the traditional economy and how everything is better than bartering used to be. But we're going to get to that in chapter 3. In this traditional economy, we have hunting, fishing, gathering, and then just bartering and trade among the locals. There isn't really a financial system in place. Here are some examples of that. Native Americans before the English came over, tribes in Africa, and the Amish often operate under this. Now, let's get into the meat and potatoes, the most important three. We can put these three on a scale. Okay, so as we take a look at this scale, we can see on the left, we have a pure command economy, meaning this is complete government ownership. Then we move along the scale to midway, where it's a mixed economy. We have partial private businesses and partial government-owned businesses. Market economy, which is mainly... Then we get right to the end, which is a pure market economy, which is mainly just private businesses with very, very little command because there's very, very little government ownership and government rule and government law. So let's get into it. First one then, a command economy. Do you recognize any of these two guys? So definition time, one where resource allocation decisions are taken by a central body. So 12 men in a room making decisions for the entire country, for millions of people. So there's usually a dictator, or it's usually a totalitarian regime. This is an extreme version. Whoa, that haircut's pretty balding. I think it's about time I adopted that haircut. Here's an example of how a command economy might operate. Now, China isn't a full command economy, but it has a lot of command elements. One thing is the 5-year plan. China basically puts out a plan and expects companies to follow this plan. And it basically states what the main goals are for China for the next 5 years. Really cool, really interesting. We can see they want technological efficiency. The US blocks chips being sold to China, so they want to be able to develop them themselves. Of course they do. Who wouldn't want technological efficiency? National security. They block Facebook, they block YouTube, they block Instagram. So all this data can be held internally on their own citizens. They want to increase national defense and reduce CO2 emissions in the country. I've lived there before. And it's a very good idea to reduce the pollution in society. So they own the major industries. They allocate the resources. They distribute the income and set the wages. They choose the production targets in the extreme form of command economies. They plan the country's growth. Here are some more examples. We've got Stalin, we've got Chairman Mao, and we've got Fidel Castro. All of these are arguably stated to be parts of command economies. Moving forward. Here's a really interesting video on Cuba, which highlights a lot of command economy traits. So let's watch this together.
El día que menos ha dado 70. madre de mis hijos es médico, un promedio de casi 900, casi 40.
Did you catch that? This guy makes more in one day than a doctor makes in a month, and he's a taxi driver. Well, he's actually a trained engineer, but engineers make even less than doctors. Welcome to the Cuban economy. Right after the Socialist Revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro's government seized almost all private businesses and land.
You won't have to worry about next year. The state will do your planning from now on.
Every restaurant, factory, hospital, and home was property of the government. The state set prices for everything and decided how much people got paid. The private sector disappeared overnight.
The world these men live in desperately needs economic reforms.
You can see the result of this if you go looking for food in Havana today. When I showed up, I was pretty excited to see what street food was on offer, but all I could find was this. Just this, ham sandwiches everywhere. Here's a typical scene in a Cuban eatery. Too many employees in an empty establishment with empty shelves. They're just waiting for food deliveries from the government.
So remember what I said. Ham sandwiches everywhere. 12 people in a room making decisions about the whole country, producing things for the whole country. You don't get a choice. Ham or cheese? Nope. Ham.
Putting in their 8 hours so that they can go home. They get paid the same whether they sell one plate of food or 50. This model just doesn't work. Cuba survived for many years with subsidies from the Soviet Union.
Viva el comunismo!
But since its collapse, the economy's been getting worse every year. This lady is showing me her government ration cards that she's kept for decades. Cubans use these cards to go to the storage houses to get their monthly rations.
El aceite que es menos cantidad, los granos que son menos, el azúcar que es menos, ni hay jabón de baño, ni de lavar, ni detergente. Bueno, cada día las menos uso.
¿Usted cree que han mejorado el proceso en alguna forma? The government realized this was becoming a problem in the 90s and started giving out private licenses, fueling a small but growing private sector. I stumbled upon a private restaurant in Havana and it was a totally different experience than the public ones. There was actually movement and good service. The owners had to sell good food if they wanted to stay in business. Which brings me back to the taxi driver and the doctor. The reason why taxi drivers make so much more than doctors is because they have private licenses. Their salaries are not set by the state, and they can charge tourists high prices. I paid $25 to get from the airport into Havana, and in that 30 minutes, this driver made more than an average monthly salary of a Cuban, which is $20.
Yo trabajo 8 horas como licenciada profesional que soy de enfermería y diario. Yo no gano 50 pesos, no gano 12 diarios.
One of the problems with this is that you get highly trained workers leaving their trade to go do remedial work in the private sector. This guy's an engineer, but he's cooking in a private restaurant. These guys are accountants by trade, but are making a killing driving around tourists on taxi bikes. This woman is a nurse, but she hasn't worked in a hospital in years. This guy is an electrical engineer, but he opened up a barber shop in his house and makes 10 times more than he would in his field of study. Imagine trying to live on the Cuban average salary of $20 per month. When you ask them how they do it, they all have the same response.
Todos tenemos que hacer algo fuera de lo que es el salario, porque si no, no como.
Just beneath the surface in Cuba is a bustling informal market, where Cubans make an additional income on top of their official salary, just to survive.
Sobrevivimos gracias a ese mercado oscuro, ese mercado subterráneo. Cuando yo bajo de mi casa y cruzo la calle para comprar el periódico, ya estoy cometiendo el primer delito de receptación. Porque ese señor anciano que está vendiéndome el periódico me lo está vendiendo a sobreprecio. Ya tienen arreglado esto con la persona que trabaja en el estanquillo, que le guarda los periódicos, se los vende.
We tend to associate black markets with dangerous activities. But in Cuba, people sell illegal popsicles or newspapers, not to get rich, but just to survive. But things are slowly changing. Since Fidel's brother Raul took over in 2008, the number of private licenses has increased significantly every year, and 20% of the economy is now private. But still, most Cubans are jaded by the decades they've had to use illegal creativity just to survive.
Nosotros vivimos en un país donde hay un solo partido. ¿Qué puede suceder? Puede haber cambio.
Very, very interesting, right? Really great video there from Vox. And this describes some elements of what we saw in a command economy. So there were some moves towards privatization, like we saw, where the taxi drivers got private licenses. Instead of making $20 a month as a doctor, you can make $30 taking one tourist from the airport all the way to wherever they live. Great, right? So a lot of people are fighting to get these private licenses, and often it's hegemonic, meaning that people's friends and cousins and brothers can get access to these, and maybe someone with the skills of being a better taxi driver might not get these opportunities. So privatization leads to a lot of disadvantages in a society like this. So moving forward then, what are some advantages that we saw of this type of economy? And don't forget, there are some. And remember, this is a biased video made by an American to report on the negatives of socialism rather than the positives. There are some positives. So we saw that there were engineers working in cafes. This means that the education is free. The people there are highly educated. That's not a bad thing, is it? So even though they're not doing the jobs that make the most money, they're switching their tack to make money from the jobs they do. The government does provide a lot of jobs in these industries. Everyone has access to good healthcare, which is great. I mean, I've been reading about Cuban research on lungs, and apparently they have some really good technology to help lung cancer, which other countries have not yet fully understood. There's schools, hospitals. There's equality among the people. You know, people feel equal. You know, people feel equal to their neighbors. And it prevents monopoly power. What is a monopoly? It's a large organization that controls lots of things. They reduce their supply, their output, and increase prices. And they're not very productive. But why is there no monopolies? Because the government is the monopoly. Never forget. Disadvantages. Quite a lot. We saw quite a lot, right? So they've got poor information. Do you remember the invisible hand? The idea that basically, if I don't like pork sandwiches, I can make tuna, cheese, salmon. I can ask what I want from the restaurant. If enough people ask for it, a restaurant will give you that because their goal is to make money. Without that goal to make money, and 12 people in a room making decisions for a whole country, then what's going to happen? Ham sandwiches for everybody. No choice. So the customer preferences are left out. There's a lack of innovation. People can't start businesses. If you start businesses and make a profit, boom, you're gone. Or it's owned by the government. So lack of innovation, lack of development. So that means lack of the Facebooks, lack of the high-tech software that we need, Instagram. And finally, slow economic growth. Now, normally I get students to just do basic advantages of disadvantages of this type of system. I'm just going to give them to you, okay? Maybe you can pause the video and write them down in your head before I show you them. We've already covered some. First, government select what industries to develop. That can be really beneficial. Think about the train line in China from Shanghai to Beijing. If you haven't ridden on it, it's absolutely fantastic, super fast, 4 hours, 1,000 kilometers, really cheap, really efficient, brilliant. And that's because people don't have land rights in China. If you don't have land rights, the government can, boom, put in that train line, fantastic. In a place like England or America where people have land rights, getting that done is virtually impossible. They'd have to upgrade existing lines, which is even more of a challenge because people need to use these lines every day. One economic goal for strength and solidarity, as we saw in the 5-year plan. They can regulate harmful substances, although that's not always the case, right? Because we've seen a lot of pollution coming from China. They can overcome market failure because they subsidize all of these things. They pay for schools, they pay for hospitals. There's equality among the people and prevent abuse of monopoly power. We've already covered this. Moving forward, disadvantages. Poor information, we did that. Can't respond to consumer preferences, the market mechanism, that's a huge one. We need that invisible hand. We need different kinds of sandwiches. We need businesses to adapt all the time to people around us because that gives us better, cheaper, higher quality products. And the lack of innovation again. So basically similar to what we did in that real video. That's it for today. We're just doing command economy today. Next time we'll do the market economy. If you want any private lessons or wish to buy any resources, you can do so in the link down below. Have a great day.